we did a shorter meeting last week, more as an introduction. I think we need a little bit more introductory section just to get to know each other a little bit more. So maybe we'll do it quick for everybody. And I don't know if I always start at the top left on my screen, and that's you, Doerte, is it? Yeah, sorry. So you unmute and then go. Yeah.
Okay, so hi everybody. It's really cool to join this group. I come through the Sense Lab through Erin Manning, who had posted about it. I'm an anthropologist, so I'm familiar with Bateson, but of course I have never read anything in its entirety. It's always been bits and bobs, so I really look forward to delving in deeper.
Good. So for those who don't know, so Erin Manning, we did a reading group on her book, The Minor Gesture, last year. And she's a philosopher in Montreal. So I imagine you're in Montreal, Doerte.
Actually, sorry, no, I'm in Barcelona. The Sans Lab is of course, I guess, physically based in Montreal with Erin and Brian Massumi, another philosopher that some of you may be familiar with. But it's an international network, and there's what's called a Europe hub and an Australian hub. So we also, with the Sense Lab, we have these reading groups that, go across time zones, and somebody always has to bite the bullet of going to bed either really late or getting up really early, like 5 o'clock in the morning or something ridiculous. And that's mostly the Australians. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we set this up so that the Europeans could come on without it being the middle of the night. So, Doug, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Doug Duff. Don't have much of an introduction. I've frequented the Internet Conversations website, so I'm familiar with the various reading groups. I'm not familiar with Bateson, so I've only read what's been assigned, and I look forward to learning a bit more from professionals or anyone else.
Great. And Doug's based in Kentucky, right?
Yeah, Frankfort, Kentucky.
Ryan?
Hello. I'm based in Edmonton, Alberta.
Wow.
So Canadian. I just completed a master's degree in interdisciplinary studies, and I'm just taking a break before I pursue further graduate studies. I'm not too familiar with Bateson. I've kind of read around him for a little while, but I've never read any of his actual work. And this is the first time I've read any of Nora Bateson's work. So that's really exciting to learn about a new author.
Great, thank you. John?
Hello, everyone. I live in Manhattan. I have an arts background, worked a lot in theater. I'm a gay activist. Worked a lot with people with AIDS, organizing self-help support groups for people with AIDS and for people with disabilities. Worked a lot with the elderly, with people with dementia. So I'm a long-term student of Bateson. I read him about 30 years ago, and he continues to perplex me. So this is my second reading of this particular book. And I have lots of questions. So I'm hoping you guys can help me answer some of these questions I have. Thank you.
Great. Phoenix, do you want to go next?
Hey everyone, I'm Phoenix, a programmer by training, live in Rhode Island, United States. Currently exploring all manner of things, community building, ecology, anthropology, sociology, just like diving in deep and like wrapping my head around lots of different ideas. Yeah, not too deeply into any particular thing. With regards to my how familiar I am with Gregory Bateson and Nora, not very. They're rather new to me. I mentioned in the last group that I came across the metapsychosis collective through a targeted ad on Facebook. And from there, like, you know, it was a synchronicity that I'd started reading Nora Bateson's book, and then this showed up, and now I'm here. So hello. And that's all.
Great, thank you. Lucy, do you want to go next? You need to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
And sorry, it's probably quite a bit of background noise, and I'm sorry I'm late. It's because I'm at the British Library, and it took me ages to find somewhere that was reasonably quiet. Oh, no, it's either really noisy in all the communal spaces, or it's, you know, silent in the reading room. So there's like trying to find somewhere in between was difficult. So yeah, hi, I'm Lucy. I was very happy to join the first reading group last week. I am from an arts background. I'm a curator, and I have run and curated galleries for the last sort of 10 years in London, which is where I'm based. I'm studying for my PhD in Newcastle, and which is in the art department, and I'm also an associate lecturer at Goldsmiths, also in London. In regards to the Batesons, I am very familiar with Gregory Bateson, but haven't actually, I mean, as in who he is and where he fits in with sort of cybernetics, well, that side of him, but I actually haven't specifically read any of his like long texts, so this is a really good thing for me to sort of be disciplined and read something end to end for once. So yeah, and Nora Bateson I actually hadn't heard of until we started this group. I was more familiar with Mary Catherine Bateson. So, and I'm also trying to get hold of the copy of her film, which I think Jeff mentioned last time. But it seems to be quite hard to get in the UK even, so who knows?
Okay.
Can turn up. But yeah,
Right.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I'm based in Quebec City in Canada. I've been involved in the infinite conversation metapsychosis community for about 2 years now. So this is, I think, the second group that I'm actually leading. The first one was the minor gesture last year for Erin Manning's book. Johnny and I have been talking about doing a Bateson group. We're both deep fans of Bateson, and we've been talking about this for about 8 months or 9 months. And so I finally decided that we're going to do this and got it organized. I am by training an astrophysicist, but I work in the arts and with people with disability, designing intelligent environments and things like that. So it's a polyglot of things, which is very Batesonian, I guess, in structure. What I propose to do is so I prepared a kind of an introduction. I did one last time, and I'm doing one today. Eventually, what we tend to do with the reading groups is we'll pass around the job of doing the introduction to different people in the group. But right now, I'm taking the lion's share of that work, just to give you a sense of how one person does it, because of course each person can do it somewhat differently. In terms of the reading for this this week, so it's the first text inside Steps to an Ecology of Mind, which is called Culture, Context, and Schismogenesis. I remember the first time I read this, I thought, what the fuck is schismogenesis? And even though after I read it, I think twice, I still couldn't get my head around this term. I couldn't remember it. I couldn't, So, I mean, maybe I can remember it now, but So there's a couple of things I wanted to say in the introductory, like he starts off with this sort of, he's responding to something in the literature, and we don't actually have access at this point to that literature. We just have his response. But I think there's a footnote that says, well, it's maybe not all that interesting to look at what was actually going on. It's more interesting to look at what Bateson said about it than the original context. But at one point he discusses the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is an idea that comes from Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, who's a philosopher who preceded Bateson. So I just thought I'd do a quick note on what that is. So fallacy of misplaced concreteness is the idea of an abstract category that's treated as if it were a thing. So it's a problem of overgeneralization. Whitehead claims that philosophers tend to do this, that they tend to take abstract ideas and then work with them as if they were actual things. And the result is that you generate a whole slew of conclusions that are false. And so this is this idea of misplaced concreteness. Bateson tends to use this idea quite a lot through his many different texts as a fallacy. He's very interested in because Steps to an Ecology of Mind, Bateson presents himself as an epistemologist, and so that's the theory of knowledge about the world, and misplaced concreteness is a problem of epistemology, and so it's an idea that he's very interested in. I'll give you an excerpt for one of Bateson's in a few minutes from his book Mind and Nature about this issue. But in the other thing that's key about this particular piece is that it deals with these ideas of symmetry and difference. So schismogenesis is the origins of difference in a sense, right? So schismo being a kind of a term for difference. And he's very, very interested in these ideas about difference. So I think it's in Mind and Nature that he defines information as being a difference that makes a difference, which is a kind of a basic idea that Bateson works with. So even though this looks like it's a piece of writing about difference in the context of culture, it's actually something much bigger, because in a way it's the first time that he talks in a serious way about difference outside of the original context from which it came, which is in the context of biology. And so in Mind and Nature, he goes into the biological roots of these ideas of symmetry and asymmetry in the biological context. And then this is, in a sense, he's taking those ideas that he developed for biology and applying them to an entirely different field, that of culture. And so and this process of taking a pattern from one domain and applying it to a different domain is fundamentally Bateson approach to doing things. So the article is much deeper than at first sight it appears to be. So if I just to give you a couple of quotes from Mind and Nature about this. So in the introduction section to Mind and Nature, he says, "It seemed to me that I was laying down very elementary ideas about epistemology, that is, about how we can know anything. In the pronoun we, I of course included the starfish and the redwood forest, the segmenting egg and the Senate of the United States." So we is a very broad idea about who's doing the work. And in the anything which these creatures variously know, I included how to grow into five-way symmetry, how to survive a forest fire, how to grow and still stay the same shape, how to learn, how to write a constitution, how to invent and drive a car, how to count to 7, and so on. Marvelous creatures with almost miraculous knowledges and skills. Above all, I included how to evolve because it seemed to me that both evolution and learning must fit the same formal regularities or so-called laws. So he's talking about the ideas are based not upon our own knowing, but upon that wider knowing, which is the glue holding together the starfishes and the sea anemones and redwood forests and human committees. My 2 manuscripts were becoming a single book because there is a single knowing which characterizes evolution as well as aggregates of humans. And then he goes on to talk about the pattern which connects, which is another preoccupation of Bateson. So in a sense, what we're seeing in Schismogenesis is an example of the application of this pattern that connects in the context of the cultural sphere. And in Nora Bateson's text, if I go back to hers, she talks about this idea that it is the right question, what is holding it together? So she's talking about the pattern that connects here as well. And the question alone might be the source of inquiry. And then at the very end of that thing, there is an alive order that we are within, and that is within us. So that's her talking about the same idea of this order and structure about in which patterns reproduce across many different domains. So to come back to the text, so Bateson then lays out 5 types of cultural unity: what I call behavioral, affective, economic, spatiotemporal, and sociological. But what's interesting about that is he starts off the text by saying what is not a distinctive characteristic in culture. So religion he excludes right from the beginning as being a characteristic that helps us understand culture. And instead he focuses on these pattern traits, if you like, these ideas of unity. Then he talks about 3 types of schismogenesis: the symmetrical type, the complementary type, and the reciprocal type. And I had trouble understanding this even on the rereading. So I worked out a couple of examples for myself to try and figure out what was going on with this. So I picked Quebec in Canada, because that's a constant thing that comes back in our part of the world. So it's the problem of a smaller group with its own identity within the larger nation with its identity. So there are behavioral unities, there are affective unity. Behavioral unities are, so he talks about logic in this context. He talks about the idea that there's a logic to behavior that crosses the community. So this idea that it's normal that a country has a distinct identity, I thought was an example of a behavioral unity in a country. The pride of country and diversity of culture, you know, that sort of Canada is proud of being multicultural and this kind of thing. These are effective sense of unity in the national context. Economic, you want citizens to feel like they're flourishing and not dying. So there's an economic component. Spatiotemporal, so there's a history that led to this, and geographic elements. and sociological, the idea of room for difference that we have in Canada, but not in every culture. But these are, so the Quebec in Canada is a symmetrical problem. But if you have, then I was looking at indigenous people versus colonists, and there we're in this complementary problem. We now have power relationships in ways that are what he calls complementary. So it's a somewhat different context. Anyway, I won't go into that in detail, but I thought it was relevant to the context. He also talks about restraining factors. So how to stabilize these systems, even when they tend to, so the idea is that when you introduce these difference mechanisms, then the system tends to become destabilized. It tends to emphasize these differences, and they become self-reinforcing. And so he's then interested in how one might reintroduce elements that would restabilize the system away from those kinds of, so he talks a little bit about some of those mechanisms. And then at the very last paragraph, he is interested in the idea of actually manipulating the culture in order to maybe render it more homogeneous, is, I think, the sense that he is talking about. But in today's world, we see many examples of people who are manipulating things in order to enhance or increase the difference. So that's the kind of thing that we see in populist governments, for instance, which are actually enhancing the differences and making them worse in a sense. So I think this is a piece. It was written in the 1920s or 1930s when Bateson was in the early days of developing his ideas about these things, and but it is still so relevant to our current world context, and probably I think the ideas that are in there are applicable and neglected in the current world in terms of using them. So that's, anyway, so that's kind of a take. I don't know if I'll open it up for other comments or questions, or whether that helps or hinders, or whether I've got it wrong. I might have it wrong. So I'm open to any thoughts and suggestions about that, or any other comments. So the way we operate is we leave ourselves mute unless we want to speak, and then we unmute ourselves, and then everybody can see that. So then it's an intention to speak, as it were.
I'm going to jump right in. Thank you. That was great. Geoffrey brought up a lot of different thoughts and ideas and feelings. Complementary, symmetrical, asymmetrical, reciprocal. These are very challenging ideas. I just wanted to quote something from the next chapter. The first chapter, I think, he talks about strict and loose thinking. I think this first chapter is a strict chapter. I think the second chapter is looser. I think some of the chapters get very loose. So I think this is a tension in his work between the strict and the loose. Not too loose and not too tight. Just the way you hold a little bird in the palm of your hand. Too tight, you're going to kill it. Too loose, it's going to fly away. So it's sort of like in that in between. So I'm going in many different directions here, so I'm trying to settle down. What comes to me right now is what's happening with the U.S. Congress. The president has shut down the government. The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, has uninvited, more or less, the president to come to Congress and speak to the nation. And she says, you know, this is my house. She recently won. Speaker of the House. So I think we're seeing this. This is a physicalization for what I would call impasse. And I think also Bateson was very interested in impasse, what dampens, what inhibits, what allows. So this is my interpretation was having the US Congress with the President of the United States, impasse. But there's also this, I'm physicalizing something else. This to me is paradox, sort of like a Mobius strip. And then this is sort of conflict where you have two equal forces that are coming at each other. And then I think we have this. This is dilemma. Could be this, could be that. I'm not sure. So I think these were the kind of forces that Bateson was working with and he recognized across disciplines. But I think it's also, and I think you pointed this out, that you know, he looked at biology, he looked at physics, he looked at sociology, he looked at anthropology, and he was looking for the patterns and the meta patterns, and most importantly, the patterns that connect and the differences that make a difference. So, but I also think that's sort of, and you guys can correct me if you think I'm wrong, I could be, because I'm not an expert at this, but there's that's sort of moving across different disciplines that are on the same level, perhaps, but have different kinds of areas of exploration. But I think there's also, I think Bateson talked about environments and behaviors in environments and capabilities and behaviors in environments and values and beliefs in those environments with those capabilities and those behaviors. And then there was an identity that holds all of that together. And above that identity, there's spirit. Some would, I think he would say, some would call this God. But this is what's happening on the interiors of us humans. This is why I think he got into epistemology, because epistemology is a very high level in the area of belief and values. But this is all revisable. And there's a lot of movement between these different levels. And he sort of saw them as nested, hierarchically. And I think those kind of communications, the horizontal and the vertical, became what he was paying exquisite attention to. So, just having thrown all that out there, I hope some of that makes sense. This is sort of a rehearsal for me because it's such a challenge. You know, you read these ideas and you try to absorb them and then you try to find applications for them. And I remember, this is a story, a personal story. Oh gosh, I guess this is in the, right at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. I was on the street, over on 14th Street, and I looked at the New York Times, and it made a declaration on the front page that because of the AIDS epidemic, the prediction was that the gay movement, which is very outspoken and just getting started, that all of those persons were going to go back into the closet. And it declared the gay movement was now dead. I remember feeling fear and rage, and I felt it in my gut. And it spread up to my chest and in my throat. Incredible contraction, constriction in the body. And even now it comes back to me as I talk about it. But I have to find a way of dealing with these painful affects. And I said, fuck the New York Times. And, you know, I got together with my friends people that I knew in bars and cafes and workplaces. We went to libraries. We went to conference rooms. And we gathered together. Went to hospitals. People that were sick. I made it my personal mission. This is very high level. You know, this is identity and above identity. That everyone who was sick, I wanted them to know that we loved them. That was very high level. And then it was, how do I implement that? So we started, you know, healing groups. We got together. You know, first it was like 10 people in an apartment. I was the only one who wasn't sick. People who were sick were treated like they had leprosy. I saw what happened to my friend Laszlo in the hospital, New York Hospital, one of the major prestigious hospitals in the world. The staff would not go into his room with his tray of food. They put his food on the floor in front of the door. And so I saw that kind of barbaric behavior. And I remember, you know, I would be the only person who would show up, who was healthy. And I would tell my friends, I said, you know, I found this group of people with AIDS and I'm hanging out with them. And they said, why would you do that? And I said, because I care, you know. And the same friends who would say, well, why are you doing that? In a cautious, frightened way, said, well, can I come too? So we saw people say, yeah, I want to help. So this is how, you know, that was a community that I could reach out and touch in a literal way. I could hold hands, I could give a hug. I think the trouble now, and I tell this is, and then I'll press the pause button so I can sort of collect my thoughts and listen to you guys, what's going on in your worlds. But the New York Times last week reported that 1/5 of the coral reef has died in the last 3 years. And when I read that, I got alarmed, red alert. And I don't know exactly what to do about it. I don't think anybody does. I don't think the US Congress has a clue. But I'm at that, but I have a great deal of confidence somehow that there's a greater intelligence. I think Bateson certainly believed that there was a deeper wisdom that we could all draw upon on special occasions. Most of the time we're living in a status quo consensus reality and we're just doing what we're told to do or what we've been taught to do. But once in a while, there are occasions where something more is required of us. And I think he called these occasions, what do you do when you don't know what to do? And he said, probably the best role models are children, because children live in a world where they don't know what to do, and they know they don't know what to do, but they're very creative. So I think that we're sort of having to, I hope to bring my attention and hopefully be sensitive to where all of your attentions are, so that we can maybe create some sort of coherent space that we could focus our attention on, I think, the issues that were very dear to Gregory Bateson and very dear to Nora Bateson. Anyway, I have much more to say, but I'm going to press the pause button, take a deep breath, and relax, try to relax. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. May I lead on from that?
Please do, Doerte. I know you have to go soon, so I was going to suggest that you speak now anyway. So,
thank you. Well, John has just given me such a beautiful line to come in on, and thinking, you know, what is it that we really need to do? But I'll try and go back to my first thought, which was, of course, also connecting with the situation in Quebec. I live in Barcelona, which is in Catalonia, and you probably are familiar with the independence here that Catalonia wants to break away from Spain and become its own territory. And I came here in 2014 to actually study this situation through movement practices, so through dancing and what they call the human towers. I don't know if you've seen documentaries on this. And it really was at the height of the movement. And since then, I've I live here, so it's become part of my life, and it's very much this, against each other. And suddenly I find I still live in the country where they claim to have a history which is 1,000 years old and gives them the right to this independence. And I guess through living here, through reading different media, through talking to all sorts of people, it's been fascinating to see, also thinking through Bateson's categories and his writing on this. You can find a line for each of the ways he looks through this. And I very much like John's idea of this, how do we find paradise? Because the situation at the moment is that the Spanish state last year in October really clamped down on the political movement here. You have people in jail, the political leaders of Catalonia, which by any sort of common law understanding of the rule of law is unthinkable. And also in terms of the civic law that you have in Germany and France. What's happening here in Spain, considering we call Europe a democratic area, is fascinating, but not in the best sense of the word. And when I was sort of reading through this chapter, for me, I mean, as an anthropologist, it brings back the origin or the original questions that sort of brought the discipline into being, and sort of looking at from these two sort of temporal points. I wondered whether, we're still asking the same questions, and we've progressed another 100 years in our human history. And at the same time, because of one of the projects I'm involved in here in Barcelona, I'm reading about the Kalahari San from Southern Africa. And the San are sort of also known as the original Bushmen, who were driven out of vast territories through invading European colonists from the 17th century onwards, and because they were considered primitive and not worthy of living. And at the same time, they're glorified. This is who we were before we became otherwise, and we lived in complete balance with nature and could sort of communicate with the animals and the plants. And that takes me to your last question, John, sort of bringing those three strands together of living in the midst of a political turmoil, of thinking back to where we were 100 years ago, and this sort of other temporal dimension, which is from somewhere between 5,000 to 30,000 years of human history. And it's like, okay, what have we really learned? And why are we still asking the same basic questions? And then thinking about, this information that we had on the coral reef was like, okay, it's really urgent that we do something. And we're still just all plodding along. And, there are groups where there's an awareness. And I think lots of people who want to somehow work with that awareness and shift something. But a lot of us, and in a way that includes myself, is like, okay, where do I start? And you can only always start with the first step. And I keep reminding myself of that and trying to keep that momentum going, and just always, take a step, do something, and hope that creates a shift. And so, reading through Bateson's text, and I really want to get more into also Nora's work. I guess the questions are there, but the answers aren't. But that still, makes it for me all the more exciting to be part of this reading group. Although I'm really sorry, I actually do have to leave now because I have a previous appointment that I couldn't change anymore. But with those light thoughts, I don't know if anybody has any spontaneous remarks. I'd love to hear them, but then I'll have to leave.
You can watch our video. We're taping this, so please.
Okay. Well,
thank you so much.
well, thank you guys. Lovely to meet you all, and see you again soon.
Next
week if you can. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, take care. Ciao.
I don't mind jumping in for a brief moment. I don't have too much to say directly about the text, as we seem to be branching off into more complex issues. I think my mantra right now is something that was in the first metalogue. Why I don't remember the title, but why are we always in a muddle, or what?
Yeah.
How did we get in this muddle? But it's just a simple phrase that no one started the muddle, no one created this mess, and we're always trying to tidy it up, but somehow it becomes more complex. It's the general gist of the quote. I'm botching it now, but the more I think about that goes back to what John was saying about the children, like being courageous enough to be in charge, but at the same time to use their imagination to create and be brave enough to think solutions. But then we do need to tidy things up after the children do their thing. And perhaps it was the earlier groups that didn't know what they were doing, the earlier children, that created this mess. And each individual, each tribe, each country has their way of tidying up the mess, which creates more of a mess. But my thoughts are evolving around that simplistic form of thought. Right. So yeah, I'll leave it at that right now.
It's a great connection, Doug. I think this idea of how we get in a muddle is obviously the ecological crisis is a muddle. And of course, Bateson's argument in the metalogue was, well, there are many more ways for it to be modeled than order. So there are many, so sort of what Doerte was saying about, we all model along, right? And all we're doing is reinforcing the muddle. When we do that, it takes a lot of effort to organize things, to order things. I mean, it's slightly pessimistic, I found. I mean, Bateson I usually take as being a fairly, not optimist, he's not optimist, but he's trying to look at the ways that we can do things to bring more order into the world, in a sense. Anyway, any help you can offer on how to get us out of the muddle and into the order is maybe good.
No problem. Okay, hi. Thanks, John. I just going back to Jeff's introduction. It was interesting that you started with the Whitehead's fallacy of concreteness, because that's kind of what I was thinking about just on my way to trying to find somewhere to join in the group. I was thinking about what it is that for me kind of holds these texts together. I mean, obviously there's no real reason why they should hold together, because the fact that we are reading them together is only by virtue of them, coinciding at the same point in the book. But thinking about how one might reflect on the other, I mean, maybe this is really basic, but it was, I was just thinking that they both kind of speak about this desire to define and categorize without destroying something in the process. And Nora, yeah, she talks about the delicate filigree of life, and how, oh, is it Nora? I've written it down. I think it's Nora, yeah. And how, you know, by sort of trying to recognize that is so important, because to miss it is a tragedy, but also trying to pin something down in too concrete a way is always going to destroy it. And that's a lot of what I think Gregory Bateson's also talking about in this idea of a categorization which is imposed on a group, which might not be recognizable from the inside. So by the culture itself, it might be, it's more of a, it's almost like a violent act on that group to define something so distinctly as religion, you know, for example, which is one of the things that comes up early in the text, like Jeff mentioned. So yeah, I mean, that's just what I was thinking about to start with for these texts. I don't know if that's useful at all or not.
Could I respond to that? Unless someone else has. Okay. Lucy, I just want to thank you for mentioning Anna Singh last time. Because I went to the library and I started reading one of her books, and she gave me a great deal of courage. Because she writes in this very paradoxical way, and she tells wonderful stories about people dealing with ecological practices. But just to riff a little bit on what the comment you made, he does say in this chapter, when administrators ask anthropologists, is it a good thing to use force in culture contexts? Then it goes on and he elaborates on what it is that administrators hope to accomplish when they hire anthropologists. And I think we're seeing the results of that kind of thinking. How do we get another culture to cooperate with us? And if we can't, what kind of force do we need to use? This seems to me to be the neoliberal drive, which has become dominant in just about everyone's culture. And Singh talks about how, you know, the people who live with the forest in a collaborative way, you know, these companies come in, they destroy the forest, use it for timber, and they leave behind their machinery, which those indigenous people take the machinery and sell the parts of the abandoned machines. And I just thought that seems to be such a relevant sort of meta perspective I think Singh is taking on our current perhaps dilemma. I think I just want to quote him sort of a little, I'm fast forwarding a little bit because I'm sort of putting together the different ways I've read him over the years, and I just came across this chapter, the second chapter, where he talks about the first chapter, I think. I think this is sort of a meta comment on his own strategy, how he works. And it's a brief paragraph. He says, I must digress for a moment to describe a trick of thought and speech which I have found useful. When I am faced with a vague concept and feel that the time is not yet ripe to bring that concept into strict expression, I coin some loose expression for referring to this concept and do not want to prejudge the issue by giving the concept too meaningful a term. I therefore dub it hastily with some brief concrete colloquial term, generally Anglo-Saxon rather than Latin. I will speak of the stuff of culture, or bits of culture, or the feel of culture. These brief Anglo-Saxon terms have for me a definite feeling tone, which reminds me all the time that the concepts behind them are vague and await analysis. It's a sort of poetic dimension I think he taps into. frequently in his parables and storytelling, and I think his stories are legendary, actually, because they embed within them all kinds of principles. So anyway, I'm just sharing that, and I'm really eager to hear other people how they're responding to this text. Thank you.
I'd like to jump in if I could.
Yeah.
There's one line at the top of page 16 in Nora Roberts' book. It goes, the thing I want to say in this book is not in any of the pieces, but is woven by you in the way you make linkings and meta-linkings. And I think that is the way to kind of progress in the muddle and to hold that delicate balance with that bird in your hand, and maybe even to harness the transformational power of the paradox or the Mobius strip. And I think it's that logical negativity, that the spaces in between and the things not said that are linked together in not even across generations in the Bateson's family, but also through the textual studies that really kind of give us some direction, some evolutionary emergent property to give us some grounding in how to proceed. Tentatively.
Brilliantly said, Ryan. I thought beautiful. I was going to say, as an example of kind of thinking that has worked, as opposed to what the sort of neoliberal approach, which we all agree is problematical. So I was involved many years ago, about 15 or 20 years ago, with a conference that brought together, or a workshop that brought together ecologists and people working in the spatial sciences, geography and my field, which was geomatics. And it was a workshop aimed at looking at how we could bridge the disciplines in terms of what the ecologists were dealing with at that time. Was they had huge demands from municipal and state, and state level governments to advise them on policy for ecological issues, in terms of land management and zoning issues and all of these kinds of complex landscape issues about what kind of policies to put in place. And so, the politicians were going to the scientists and saying, well, we need you to tell us what to do. And the scientists said, well, we don't understand the ecology well enough to be able to tell you what to do. We understand bits of it, but we don't understand even how an ecology works as a whole. And so, so this was one conference, one workshop that sought to start to build the connecting pieces together. And recently, in the context of some work I was doing with people with disability, and in this kind of context, I was looking at sustainability practices, and I went back to the literature on landscape ecology and these kinds of issues. And in the meantime, in between the workshop which I attended and the situation today, there has emerged a robust, it's not a complete theory, but it is complete enough that they now understand, the scientists now understand how the dynamics of ecologies work in a way that they didn't 20 years ago. And this has emerged in the middle time. Now, of course, we're in a situation where the politicians are not paying attention as much as they used to 20 years ago. They were asking, but they haven't listened as much. But it is this emergence of an understanding at a deeper level of what's going on that is actually very encouraging in this context. So, although there are lots of areas that are still need to be developed, I think this is a kind of what you're talking about, Ryan. This kind of instead of trying to nail things down, which is the neoliberal approach, you work with the spaces between the silences in the music I have a composer friend who says music is all about the silences. It's what happens between the notes that matters, not the notes themselves. And this is the kinds of work that we need to do in order to move from the one state to the other. Anyway, so it is kind of an anecdotal way to get to the something close to what you're talking about, Ryan. Thank you for that.
I guess going back to how to solve all of the world's problems and many different voices that you just mentioned, Geoffrey, how things should be done, or political views of how things should be done. But I'm thinking right now of overpopulation, yet at the same time, in a non-forceful way, there should be, though there doesn't have to be, but there can be a way to utilize anyone and everyone on the face of the planet for what needs to be done, if it can be defined in a certain way. Like you're saying, 20 years ago, there wasn't a set kind of understanding of how the ecological, perhaps, paradoxes work. And I'm inclined to believe that once we understand, like Ryan's saying, like we're all sort of getting at, once we are able to make those bridges into various paradoxes, or maybe make a weave into a paradox, or into the variant ways of thinking, and never, there's political view called metamodernism, which essentially states that that's the idea there of politics. We don't know what's going to work, and we should start there. And it's kind of a ground up way of seeing things. And then once something does work for the whole, once there's perhaps full agreement, then you can go to the next level of, well, we need, there's the paradox right now of more people in America, at least, are dying of overeating than malnutrition. That's, I don't know the exact fact there, but for that to be a problem of more people dying of overeating, then that seems to have we have solved the problem of lack of food. We've solved the basic level of, or can solve it, I'm saying. Obviously it hasn't been solved because of political issues, but that one example there is proof that, well, we do have an abundance of food, but it's not being doled out around the world, around to even in America, where people are dying of overeating. There are still homeless, there are still people not getting enough food. And why is that? And just that simple question there, out of the 10 billion other questions we could ask, it's kind of proof that we can utilize the various knowledges we have, but we're not quite there yet, of course. But
I hope this is a difference that makes a difference. I actually think if this prolonged shutdown of the government continues, right now it's federal workers aren't getting their paychecks. They're expected to work for nothing. You know, once this hits the people, the food stamp program, people who, you know, need food stamps in order to eat, once that shuts down, what happens next? So I think there are fat people because there's cheap food filled with, you know, fats and salt and lots of sugar, and it's cheap, and they eat it because they can't afford anything else usually, and they've developed a taste for it, perhaps an addiction to it. So I think it's a little more complex than just, you know, I think it's like the analogy would be right now we're starving, a family with 4 children that would starve 3 children so that 1 child could get obese. That's, I think, an accurate metaphor for our current situation. So I'm just throwing that out there as another analogy. I think this is what Bateson did. He he thought when there was a vague concept, like he said, he went for analogies. And then analogies, our percepts, our concepts start to reorganize. And through the use of metaphor and anecdote and story, our concepts can function more effectively. So anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. Thank you.
Also, Bateson was a system. I mean, he's one of the 20th century's most preeminent systems theorists. His whole work is organized around systems and understanding systems. However, the problem with systems and the systems approach is that there is no place for the individual in a system. Systems are about groups and general behavior, and the idea of individual is excluded from the analysis at the systems level. But Bateson knew that, and so one of the features of Bateson's work is that he struggles with this issue about how to keep awareness of the individual within a system's perspective. You know, in order to get out of the ecological crisis, we have to apply systems principles. It can't be done on an individual basis. But we have to, if we just applied the systems principles, we would lose the connection with the individual, which is the motor of the whole system in a way. And so I don't think Bateson has full answers to those questions, but I think he poses the questions. And you see this in Nora's work also. She, in a lot of ways, her writing is actually a kind of way of re-emphasizing the dilemma between the system and individual with a little bit more, because Gregory Bateson tends to be a bit more systemic in his thinking, and Nora tends to bring us back to the individual within that context, even though they're both present in both sets of writing. It's worth pointing out too that Gregory Bateson could be wrong. He wasn't always right. We tend to think of him as I tend to think of him as kind of God. But I need to keep the critical perspective alive.
I had a bit of a question that I don't know, maybe someone can help with. So, as Geoffrey said at the beginning, what Gregory Bateson does in a lot of his writing, as you were describing, this is not my thoughts, was that he uses the descriptors and the patterns from one realm and applies it to another as a kind of a analytical methodology. And I was wondering what the kind of lineage of that is in relation to Deleuze and Guattari, because Gregory Bateson was obviously a big influence on them both. And Guattari in his writing talks about this process of metamodelization, which is I can't remember how he describes it in exact words, but it's the idea of forcing one model through another as a way of kind of providing a new perspective on a problem. It's something that he used in schizoanalysis. And I was wondering if anyone knew anything about that as a kind of direct connection between Gregory Bateson and particularly Guattari. Maybe someone knows more than I do about that. Okay, I'll look into it.
It's a great question. I mean, we know Whitehead influenced Deleuze and Guattari, but they never talk about Whitehead. So I don't know to what extent they talk about Bateson.
I'm reading this Theosophy.
Yeah. So, so I think that the main text that it comes up in Guattari is schizocartographies, I think.
Okay.
I was just trying to find a reference for it, but I could only find someone else talking about it instead. So, yeah. Oh, I can't find it now. But anyway, it's something to look into, I think, because it's a connection I hadn't previously made. So, so yeah, we'll see.
We could always treat it as a question for the series rather than for today. So I will go back and think about it, and maybe we'll come back on it another time as well. So, because it's a big question.
I don't know anything about Deleuze or Guattari, but you did say forcing one model into another, and we've already mentioned force in the Schismogenesis piece that we read, that he was going against using force or questioning using force. But I don't know where that lies in the whole scheme of things right
now. I may be wrong, Lucy, and I'm not an expert on Guattari or Deleuze, but I've been reading a lot lately. And I like Deleuze talks about the plane of immanence. I think he draws a great deal from Bateson. But I'm just remembering Bateson. He was, I think it was the Palo Alto group. This was at the beginning of family therapy. And I think I've told this story before because it's sort of I think I got it from Bateson. There was when they studied families, the family would be in a conference room with a therapist. And on the other side, there was a one-way mirror or a window. You couldn't see, the family could not see through this window. But the group of therapists, they could look in a one-way fashion to the family. They would watch the therapist interact with the family. They would come up with an intervention, and they would phone it in. The phone would ring. The therapist who was with the family would pick up the phone, listen to the intervention, deliver the intervention. So it's a very top-down, one-way communique. But I believe it was Bateson and Weakland and Václavic. There were a lot of practitioners very interested in cybernetics. They said, well, what would happen if we took down this one-way mirror? What would happen if we went into the room with the family? And they did. And what happened was chaos. The family listened to the experts' interventions and rejected them. So we had, the observers were now being observed, and there was a tremendous shift that occurred in Bateson's thinking, because we were going, I think, from a first order cybernetics where there's a clear observer, I'm the observer, you're the observed, to something that's more two-way, two-way communique. So we have observer participants. And I think when we have observer participants, the questions we ask change the system very quickly, actually. So I think that's something that I think Bateson was exquisitely aware of, and I think Bateson and Guattari and Deleuze as well. Are we in a one-way communication, or is this a two-way communication where we are observer participants? And there's some who are saying we're moving from a first order to a second order. There may be a third order, who knows? But can we handle the intensities that occur when we are participant observers rather than observer observed? And I think this is where Deleuze and Guattari focus a great deal of their attention on, where they talk about bodies without organs, and how do we handle, you know, where it's not really clear. We're not skin encapsulated egos anymore. So where do we begin and end with one another, or with our environments, and what kind of ecological practices could emerge when we achieve this sort of second order capacity? So anyway, those are my that's my riff on what you were asking, Lucy. I hope that stimulates something. I'll have to go back and continue to read this book. I'm reading a book right now, The Three Ecologies by Guattari. So it's a thin little volume, but I think I'll reread it and get back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. I think what you're describing is it's maybe kind of partly what Margaret Mead was doing with the Anthropologist, and obviously Gregory Bateson's wife for some period, thinking about the observed system, and the I can't remember if it came up in this chapter or maybe it came up last week, but the classic kind of the impossibility of being a neutral observer in a system that you're already implicated in. So, and Margaret Mead was talking about doing field work in, I can't remember where, but working with tribes in, I think maybe in South America, I can't remember. And, you know, by the presence of the observer is automatically always affecting that system. So that was really ineloquently put, sorry. But I think this speaks to what you were saying, so. I don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts on any of that.
And isn't Guattari also arguing against the sort of classic psychotherapy situation with the psychologist and the client, and that one-way sort of power relationship between the two? A lot of his work is attempting to break that mold and create something else.
Yes, that's what anti-Oedipus was.
Yeah.
Schizoanalysis. But they see this is a part of capitalism. Capitalism produces this schizoanalysis. So yes, I think you're right.
I just also like to mention that you know, we're kind of participant observers in the system of the Bateson family and the Bateson family itself. And I've been reading with a Daughter's Eye by Mary Catherine Bateson. It's a memoir about her parents when she was growing up and when she was older, and a colleague of them. And so just thinking about some of the facts about the family, Mary Catherine Bateson was born in 1939 and Nora Bateson was born in 1969. And so that's 30 years difference. And Mary Catherine Bateson's child was born in 69. So there's kind of an overlapping of generations that kind of form the system in the Bateson family. And then there's this kind of overarching pattern of systems and intersecting circles that their work kind of corresponds to. And I think when we talk about systems, where's the boundary of the system? And we're all kind of implicated in their work and participating in it and having it transform our lives in different ways, and also giving new interpretations of their work. And so I think it's just kind of getting back to those spaces in between. I think we're generating new spaces, and it's kind of unfolding from there.
That's a really good point, and I'll just share briefly a personal experience of having my in-laws from the Philippines move into my household. And I knew a lot of changes would happen, but in the Philippines, my wife's from a village of not necessarily what would be studied by the Batesons or Margaret Mead or something, but I got a chance to go over there, and there's so much family unit, so much structure within a certain space that is non-existent in Western culture. And to have her parents come over now, our household is much bigger. But of course, I'm going to work daily. Everyone else is sticking around the house. But to have, I'm rethinking time, as I've done multiple times. I'm rethinking how my family will be structured. I have 2 younger boys, and how their life will be changed. And having 3 generations within the household, and as a microcosm of perhaps what may or may not work within the larger structure, where the elders are kind of thrown off to the side in certain cultures, or thrown into hospitals now. And children tend to not interact based on maybe technology with the old stories from even 1 or 2 generations ago of their own family unit. So there's lots of divides going on. But yeah, it's been nice to have this reflective attitude going on in my house, as I reflect upon family dynamics and everything.
Yeah, we spoke a little bit last week about the family dynamics in the Batesonian context. So they're definitely, because at some point we're talking about 4 generations of Batesons. Obviously, Mary Catherine and Nora in the middle generation, below, after Gregory Bateson. But you have Nora's daughter writes the preface for her book, so that's the younger generation. And William Bateson, of course, is the father of is a kind of father of genetics. He's the person who coined the term genetics, and he played an important role in biology in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So so we're looking at 4 generations, and also we're using, so I'm sort of aware of that this morning when I was dipping through Mind and Nature. Mind and Nature was written 30 or 40 years after these texts. So we're using later Bateson to understand earlier Bateson too. So because the pattern that connects it affects Bateson and his life and his writings, as well as it connects all of these different disciplines between them. And so we're using that in that context as well as the regard of Nora or Mary Catherine on Bates on his works. So all these nested recursive connections are fascinating.
Yes, I think Nora goes a little further than her father does in looking at I think it's Haraway, is it symbiopoiesis? Is that the term she uses? Symbiopoiesis, which is sort of the idea of symbiotics, how, and Haraway and Margulis and a lot of feminist biologists, anthropologists have this way of thinking. I think this is what Bateson was referring to as reciprocity. But how do we do this? I mean, how are we going to care so much that we're going to reorganize our behavior? So I'll just give you a little experiment that I conducted on myself. And I think this is where the arts come in. And Bateson loved poetry and quoted it often. And I think there's, I was thinking about the coral reef, and that 1/5 of the coral reef has died in the last 3 years. I just felt a pang of grief. And I woke up at 3 in the morning, as I often do, and I just sat up in my chair, did a little breathing exercise, and I started to tune in. And I found myself spontaneously singing a song, just like a lullaby, to someone who's dying, or a child that you love who's sick, has a high fever. You know, you sit there next to them and you just, open your heart to them, and you just feel a flow of energy, love. And I was doing this with a coral reef. I just sang a song. And then I went to sleep, and I had a dream. And in the dream, there was a man who lived in a tree. And I was the man who lived in the tree, and he was able to talk. So I was the man, and I was watching the man who was in the tree. So it was sort of like I observed him, and I was him. So you know how dreams are; they're kind of weird. And then I woke up this morning, and I'm reflecting upon that. So, and I think that Bateson and Nora and Catherine and Margaret Mead, who certainly was a member of the family, I think they in looking at ecological practice and some of the current thinkers that are who are revising some of what previous generations discovered and adding something to that. It's often reported that, you know, all of us could be shamanic. We could all think shamanically. It's not that hard. It's deep. It's actually hardwired in us. We've been trained actually to stop doing it. But we all have telepathic rapport, because you can't separate culture from nature. And I think this is what's happening that's new is we're looking at there are multiple cultures, multicultural, but there's also multiple natures. We live in a multi-natured, complex, you know, where the boundaries are negotiable. And our identities, new subjectivities will very much emerge, are starting to emerge as we drop certain fixations and reifications and, you know, dead stories that don't work anymore. We're going to new sensitivities. Sometimes this can be extremely intense, but I think that when we can start communicating and with these new identities, new subjectivities, a new metaphysics no doubt will emerge. And I expect new economies as well. So I'm just saying, let's fasten our seatbelts. Maybe that's the wrong metaphor, because I don't know in the future we're going to have any seatbelts or any cars for that matter. But anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. How can we use our imaginations in ways that can heal, and how can we be alert to the double messages that we can use our imaginations to destroy? So we all have forked tongues here. All of us have had to lie and deceive ourselves and others in order to survive in the current system. But I think since it's becoming more and more not about an employer-employee relationship where there's identities that emerge out of that relationship, since we're living mostly in a gig economy from month to month, those identities, I think, are dissolving very rapidly. And we're not quite sure what's going to happen next. I'm just trusting our imaginations and that deeper wisdom. If we can take the risk of sounding a little bit lunatic, like I feel like I am right now, talking about my dreams in a public forum. But I think this isn't encouraged too much, but I think we should start encouraging it, you know, because we can coordinate these different levels of mind nature. This is what Bateson was all about. And learning how to, you know, what starts out as vague and weird and unusual can become a new norm if we sort of relax our boundaries and then reorganize. I think, Lucy, you talked about altered states of consciousness in our last meetup, and that's a study of yours. So that's a study of mine as well. So thanks.
Well, yeah, I have to say that I agree with almost all of you said. I think that the pattern that connects and the underlying order in the nature culture is, I know Gregory Bateson was an atheist, but I think that's as close as he comes to maybe something like God. And I think the logical negativity and the things unsaid and unseen and the spaces in between have a lot to do with the feminine value sphere, and the emergent of the feminine value sphere in more public life, and really kind of establishing those interconnections in a palpable way, maybe not so much formalized, because we don't want to use force to concretize or misplace concreteness and reify it, but to really live in that pattern that connects and kind of vibrate with that, I think would be, I think that's what Nora Bateson is pointing to in a lot of her essays and poems.
Phoenix, I wondered if you had anything that you'd like to offer. I hate to put people on the spot, but it is part of my role, so.
No worries. I've been rather quiet. Yeah, I was just sort of like in a mental hallucination of following the train of thought that John had sort of facilitated for me, and one of the random thoughts that came to mind. Well, it's not really random. It's sort of like something that I'm considering in terms of like the profound shifts that human civilization will need to make to ensure the longevity of the species, with regard to the collective understanding that there's this huge climate change monster that may very well already be a climate collapse monster, in which case, there's different degrees of how bad that could be. But anyways, so I've been thinking about how we might shift the American value system and American culture into one that's more like artistic, moving people away from this profound desire to consume and more towards enjoying the products of the imagination. Sort of so instead of going out and buying a whole bunch of random shit, we get together and entertain ourselves with the products of our mind. So that might be like conversation or improvisational theater. So sort of using all the stuff that we've seen so far and everything we've collected through movies and participation in society, and sort of just going with that and hallucinating together so that we're not consuming, and finding the entertainment value in that. And this sort of goes into that, it ties into the shamanic and altered state of consciousness component of what John said too, because I think that we're sort of trying to physically physically bring things into space that exist in our minds, but there's something to be said about the possibility of not having to do that, and sort of sharing that idea and making it something that people see value in, so that culture, so that this improvisational theater or conversation culture propagates and becomes the new norm. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm trying to remember. There was something else that I wanted to mention. I think I was thinking about, I don't know how to pronounce this person's name, Marcia Elliott or something. They mentioned the they released all these tomes on like the shamanic experience, and so like I think like sharing stuff like that would be really valuable, but I don't know how to have people see the value in that. And we're also operating under some really serious time constraints, and there's all these like bad actors that have their own plans that are unlikely to like modify their plans in a way that is beneficial for everyone instead of just themselves. So they're likely to continue to want to fuck shit up as things are like getting worse. And so just like, I don't know, I don't know how like substances that facilitate altered states of consciousness and practices like improvisational theater and like intentional imagining, yeah, I don't know. I think those things would be really useful and valuable, but getting people to see the value in that and then having people like make that become a really integral part of their lives escapes me, but it's something that I'm really curious about. That's kind of where my mind went with what John had said. Doesn't really seem.
No, that's great. It reminds me of Johnny has a discussion about slowing things down, and those things become more relevant when we slow things down. They get, when we're all focused on efficiency, you know, altered state of consciousness, it goes out the window. But if you slow things down, that becomes important, right? So I think there's a connection there, perhaps, too.
I just wanted to respond to that, Phoenix. Improvisational theater and Mircea Eliade, I think that's how I pronounce it. I don't know what the proper pronunciation is either, but he wrote a lot on shamanism. You said that you mentioned substances and intentional imagining, and how do you and curiosity, and how do you make that an integral part of your life or the life of others? You didn't know, I don't know either. I think that's I think our curiosity can really be opened up when we admit that we don't know. This is what we want, but we don't know exactly how to make it happen. And also what you mentioned, Ryan, about resonance. I think you said resonance and vibration. I said vibration, but I think resonance and vibration is very common. We use these terms quite interchangeably. But I think, and what Nora Bateson and her father as well, I think they were into this space, these liminal zones, these affective zones, where metaphor is the law of the land rather than analytics. So I think we're and where vibration and resonance between groups becomes front and center in our attention. I remember reading about an anthropologist, I can't remember his name, but he was in a country he was studying. He did not speak the language, and he was on a road, and he met a man who was deaf, a native. So a deaf mute and a man who doesn't speak the language met each other on the road. And they hadn't, they just had their bodies. And the anthropologist reported that he discovered from this person that he met on the road, who was a stranger, that this man was visiting someone who lived in another village, an elder woman who had cancer. And he was visiting her, and he was going to take care of her. And he said he had no idea how he knew this. All he had was gestures and movements and, and those affective zones. And so I think that's a very curious story, and an interesting one that we have when we have to, when we drop this language game, we have all kinds of capacities for entering into rapport with strangers, and no doubt our humans could not have survived if we didn't have these latent capacities. You know, this probably is where all of our cultures come from. Anyway, I'm just sharing that. Thank you.
And when you put children together who don't speak the same language, they get along fine, and they do all sorts of games and play together, and they have no idea what the other person's saying, but it doesn't matter. So.
So I'd like to think of us as all children here right now. We're doing what we love, which is read and talk about what we've read with like-minded individuals. And Phoenix noted that Johnny gave us permission to use our imagination here right now. And when you were talking about your dream, I love trees. I loved climbing trees when I was a kid. I sought out books by others that wrote fiction about trees, like Hermann Hesse, and I think Italo Calvino has The Baron of the Trees. I don't remember the content of that book, but essentially he decides, he's got the main character, this perhaps teenage boy or preteen boy, decides to go and live in the tree away from his, sounds like a wealthy family. And he hangs out there, and the story's about the dynamics of that. But the tree is a good metaphor for longevity, roots in the ground, and if we were all able to be in the perspective of the tops of the tree, that's a bird's eye view, but it's not necessarily flying too high into the clouds, or wax melting if you go too high. So it's still grounded, you're still within the earth, but it's an alternate view. Some of us might live in apartments and we can look out our windows from up high, but it's not as good of a natural picture. It's a view of the world that man has created, humans have created, of brick buildings all around you. And then there's the image of the man in the ivory tower, looking down upon others. And that's not the view from the tree. That's natural. And I guess building off of what Phoenix was talking about, I've always recently, over the past few years, I've had this concept of like, how do we influence others? Like, we are all here right now because we're like-minded, at least in the fact that we don't want to harm others. We want to just have a discussion. The others might see us as wasting our time. We should be physically working, should be earning money right now, or providing that to society, or I don't know, watching some other TV show because this is boring shit here that we're talking about. But to get others into the level that we're at, we're not better than anyone, but it's a level of kindness, I believe, towards humanity, towards others. So how do we get others to view that? And I've used the word force in this, but it's forced enlightenment, I guess. Not like Clockwork Orange type of keeping the eyes open and seeing the horrors of the world, but there are psychedelic drugs that people use. There are but you can't force that onto people. You can't force medication or put it in the water source to make everyone have the same level of thought of how are we going to save the other 4/5 of the reef. So how do we do that? I don't know, but I think dreams, we've talked about dreaming, the imagination, it's harmless for the most part. An idea might harm someone else who is not ready to hear it, but to share thought space is great. And I don't know much about the Whiteheadian term, but the fallacy of the concreteness. So maybe if you go too far into abstract, then you're forgetting the concrete world. So that's why I like the metaphor of the tree. Yeah, and virtual reality, things like that have promise, but of course it probably won't lead to what a lot of us here might imagine virtual reality can be used for. It'll be more of a matrix type of situation where, well, we've got this mass of people, let's throw more video, more dreams that are not necessarily theirs, but created by the man in the high tower. And yeah, I would like to see a shift in the worldwide dream.
I think one of the elements that has connected a lot of what has been said recently in this group today is sensitivity, and I think sensitivity comes with kindness and being able to enter those spaces in between and being able to reflect on imagination, dreams, non-ordinary states of consciousness, or the difference between states of consciousness, and recognizing the value they have for waking life. I think that being able to sense that there is something incredibly problematic with the world order today, it also comes with sensitivity. And I think there's a lot of pressure in our culture to fill the gaps, fill those spaces in between, and just kind of run on autopilot and get your fix of McDonald's or your social media. And I think that, however, over the lifespan, as time kind of accelerates and there's more of those spaces in between for people to kind of fall into and to explore, and to really kind of see that there's greater depth with greater sensitivity, and there's more of the world and to explore, that kind of opens up. And I think the poetics in the Batesons and Margaret Mead really point to that cultural pattern that's beyond culture, that's really below the surface of culture, and points to a pattern that connects, and it's really given voice by their poetics.
So key words here that pop out for me: the worldwide dream, the tree, the values of kindness, and Ryan just mentioned sensitivity, and Phoenix mentioned improvisational theater. And weaving together, entering into the weave. And I just sort of want to add to that the sense of touch. And for me, touch is extremely there's a kind of touch that isn't necessarily kinesthetic. It's sort of touch at a distance. So you can use your mind to touch at a distance, and you can pick up on things as well, and you can embody them and re-embody them. I noticed this when I was working a lot, working with clients, because I was working energetically, and I used therapeutic touch and Reiki and various other kinds of really new agey kind of techniques. They're very powerful. And I was opened up to all kinds of telepathic capacities that I did not know that I had, so that I was able to accurately diagnose certain conditions through the sense of touch. And I could say, well, I don't think that's cancer, because that was something that often, clients would be afraid of. And they would present a symptom, and I would just put my hand there and say, no, it's not cancer, but go see your doctor and get a test. And then they would often come back to me and tell me, you were right, it wasn't cancer. And there was a corroboration between sometimes my verbal reports to them and what the doctor told them after giving them a test, a lab report. So I found that very, very curious, because I had no idea where that information comes from. But I know that there's a sense of touch, and then there's an open current that happens between people. in close proximity. And, you know, those subtle bodies that, you know, in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a vast literature on the subtle realms and how they interact with the physical. So we have a physical body, we have a subtle body, many subtle bodies, and we have a new emerging virtual bodies. And this is what we're speaking through right now. So I think this is something new, and I don't think we have any adequate maps for this kind of territory, of how these different kinds of bodies can enter into rapport. So that's why I'm talking about touch as that we can use our minds to touch, and we can use our language. And I think Bateson and Nora and her father were very sensitive to this dimension of how we use language and poetry and metaphor and rhythm and rhyme. And there are some poets here. Geoffrey is a poet, so is Doug. I've enjoyed many of their recitals. So I think these are stuff. I think we're creating an identity right now, this group, that elusive I, we, what happens between the I and the we. So I believe as we share our values and our doubts and our fears and our aspirations, a new kind of identity can start to emerge through our high levels of rapport with each other, maximizing, you know, focusing it on kindness rather than competition. We're hardwired to compete in our culture. So how do we drop that and try to, you know, bring forward these traditionally feminine ideas of symbiosis and reciprocity? So I think we're doing a pretty good job. I've loved this conversation today. I think it's very aesthetically enjoyable, and I hope we can continue in this direction. Thank you.
Yeah, we need to, like Gregory Bateson wrote in Mind and Nature, we need to expand our we to include the coral reefs. They're part of the we, right? That's part of what we've done. We've made the boundary around humankind and excluded the natural world. And of course, the natural part is part of we. And if we had that shift at a planetary level in the culture where we understood we to be inclusive, we would maybe step out of this cycle. The title of the text is Culture Contact and Schismogenesis. So we've talked a lot about the culture, but in fact, the word contact was built into the text, and implicitly is this idea of touch already in there in the text that Gregory Bateson presents us with. And I agree for the tactile. In fact, it's interesting because today we talk about embodied approaches where we're very clued into the importance of the body in these things. And Bateson doesn't talk a lot about the body, but it's always there. It was an era where we didn't explicitly refer to it, but in writers like Bateson, it was always present nonetheless. Yeah. So we're coming up to the end of the 2-hour slot. I wonder if, Johnny, would you agree to doing the next week's one, because it's on that second chapter that the loosely structured chapter, and you're good with the introduction. So I thought it would, since you know the process, it would be good for and then somebody else, you can think about whether or not, like, the next week after that one is on the notion of nation, and somebody else could think about, you don't have to identify yourself today, but think about coming back on that one. And then after that, it's the one on Bali, which is extraordinary text. So, just so we can talk about it again next week, but or if anybody has any urges to do that. So final comments, final words.
I just wanted to sort of drop this in because it just kind of connected with the nice description that Doug made about of the climbing trees and trees generally and a bird's eye view and things like that. And because I've been reading for something that I'm working on, Deserto's Practice of Everyday Life, and in the first part of one of the chapters on walking, it starts off when he's in the he's at the top of one of the World Trade Center towers, and he's talking about the city as a maze, and he talks about the how he's describing the view, and he says how the desire to see the city from up high predated the means of satisfying that. So in Renaissance and medieval painting, it's very well known. A lot of the painters were often making projections of the city, like as a kind of a fictional viewpoint, and I think that kind of idea of fictionalizing a view and creating it, and then kind of continuing that as a kind of practice, just seemed to resonate with what some of the last few comments that we've just been made in this session. So it just kind of connected a few points in my mind, that's all.
I don't have any official closing statement. I just want to note that I have been frequenting these reading groups for a while. I'm pretty shy, but anything goes. So the sharing of dreams, even the thought process, you were put on the spot, Phoenix, but that really helps guide the conversation. Even if it has nothing to do with the text, it does. So I appreciate what you said, Phoenix, and what everybody else has said here. So just a thanks and an invitation to be as creative as you desire.
Hello. I was just thinking a lot about what you mentioned earlier regarding tree climbing. There's this person, so this is like a plug. There's this person on YouTube. His name is Rafe Kelly, and his YouTube channel concerns like freedom of movement, and so he also like goes on about tree climbing and how humans are really removed from nature, and that's causing all sorts of like maladies, and we have this really constricted like there's something about society that causes us about American society that causes us to restrain our movement, and that limits our capacity to think creatively. So like he sort of goes into his theories and hypotheses on that channel, but he has like really just really nifty tree climbing and like free running videos and stuff. And that's actually how I learned how to climb trees, through this channel. And I was only inspired to look into that after my first psychedelic experience. Like after I had that experience, I sort of started this like rapid transition towards becoming a naturalist and just spending like massive amounts of time in nature. Don't recall the rest of that thought, but yeah, it seems like a cool thing to check out, I guess.
How would you spell his first name?
I'm sorry?
How is the first name spelled? You said Rafe Kelly, something like that.
Yeah, Rafe Kelly, Kelley.
Thank you.
I think, Ryan, you had something you wanted to add to it.
Yeah, thanks. Just going back to the subtler bodies, I learned about this concept. It's called telepresence. It's about being absorbed and present in these digital or multimedia scenarios. And I think also it, in a psi way, we're forging non-local connections in different parts of the world as we communicate and assemble on this online platform. So there's identity being formed, definitely.
Okay, I wanted to finish up with, so I'm going to read the final poem of Nora Bateson, because I think it's a lovely, because it's titled Breathable, but the word breathable doesn't figure in the poem, so it's this sort of meta level. So, in the looking is what is seen. The baskets to put ideas in have open tops and holes in the sides, woven in sleepy stitchery. Loose loops cradle lightly. It does not awake in form, but dreams willy-nilly of the treetops reflecting the roots, while light changes angles in water, playing with geometry. Seconds pass into songs for transport, because rain on dust is a beginning of mud and life. So we'll end there. And just a reminder,
We lost you, Geoffrey. But I guess we are, I can't hear Geoffrey. Can anyone else hear him? Okay. Well, he already ended our session beautifully with that poem. So blessings to everyone. Have a great week. Looking forward to seeing you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Geoffrey. Oh, and we can all view this recording. It'll be recorded and posted. So, and any comments in the forum, it would be very appreciated. Thank you.